Welcome to the RescueSF speaker series, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Sean Carlin, and I'm with the India Basin Neighborhood Association. Today, we've invited San Francisco Chronicle journalist Kevin Fagan to speak with us about covering homelessness in San Francisco. Our host of this series is Lori Brooke, one of the founders of RescueSF Coalition. And RescueSF is a grassroots, community-led movement that is deeply concerned with the poverty that is prevalent in our streets and actively engaged with discovering how we can best work towards equitable solutions. That said, RescueSF is hosting our speaker series and providing these videos as a public service. The views expressed by our guests are their own, and their appearance on RescueSF speakers does not imply an endorsement of them or the entities they represent. We will structure this talk with the first 30 minutes dedicated to Kevin Fagan and Lori Brooke having a conversation. And in the second half, we'll be reading some of your questions for Kevin to respond to. You can submit your questions in the Q&A, in the Zoom Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. And with that, let me welcome our host, Lori Brooke. Lori?
Thank you, Kevin and Sean, for being here. So I'm Lori Brooke. I am currently the president of the Cow Hollow Association, and I have been a part of RescueSF since it started this February. For those of you that were here last week, welcome back. And for those of you that are here for the first time, welcome. And so for those, I'll give you a quick overview of RescueSF since you may not be as familiar. So we began in February as a response to residents' frustration with the decline in the quality of life in San Francisco. Our mission became to bring clean and safe streets to all San Franciscans. But to address specifically the homelessness crisis, we are seeking for effective solutions for helping the unsheltered off the streets and for preventing more people from becoming homeless. And we know that we are not going to find easy answers. So RescueSF has two main objectives. First, to educate ourselves and others through our speaker series about the homelessness situation in San Francisco. And second, to build a citywide coalition that will advocate together with a united voice for effective solutions, not only from City Hall, but from Sacramento and Washington, D.C. As part of our journey, we are sponsoring a speaker series, as you are a part of today, called RescueSF Speakers. You may or may not agree with everything a speaker says, but we think it's very important to hear from all voices and perspectives regarding efforts to end homelessness. Using this wide lens, we can begin to see what is working, what is not, and what needs to change. So let's begin. Today, we have with us Kevin Fagan, a longtime reporter in the San Francisco Chronicle. Kevin has been a reporter for more than 40 years and has reported on homelessness in many countries. From 2003 to 2006, Kevin was the only beat reporter in the United States covering homelessness full-time. He specializes in news feature writing and breaking news, taking particular pleasure in ferreting out stories others might not find, from profiling the desperate lives of homeless drug addicts to riding the rails with hobos, finding people who sleep in coffins, and detailing the intricacies of hunting down serial killers. We are very pleased to have Kevin Fagan here today to share his perspective on homelessness in San Francisco. So welcome, Kevin.
Hi there. Nice to be here.
Great. Thank you for joining us. And so before we dive into the series of questions that I have, just love to kind of pull back here and just get a high-level overview of what made you so passionate about reporting on homelessness.
Well, as you said, I've been doing this a long time, and I spent quite a bit of time poor as a kid. Been on my own since 16, traveled the world as a street singer, sleeping in doorways and then in vans and then playing bars. I kind of had a bit of a street experience early on, which made me interested in that thing. I mean, they say write what you know. So I kind of knew what it was like to be outside and to not have any money. And poverty was an early emphasis of mine. I also specialize in disasters and mass murders and, a lot of the things that us newspaper reporters get into over the years. But homelessness really captured my heart, especially when I got deep into it in the 1980s. And that's when homelessness as we know it began to happen. And by the late 80s, it was chronic. And then in the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, I was working at the Oakland Tribune, and thousands of people became homeless because of the quake. It rattled the poorer areas of town really badly and threw a lot of people in the street. And I got deep into it then and kind of never climbed out of it. Like I said, I've done a lot of other things. I've been an editor. I worked overseas. But the very idea that we have people who have to sleep in the street or in shelters is just amazing to me. And other places I've lived in around the world don't have it like this, except for the poorer countries. But other westernized systems like ours, they don't treat their people like this. And it's endlessly fascinating to me and saddening to me that this happens. And I feel a responsibility as a newspaper reporter to try to shed light on things that can work, shed light on the problems that need to be addressed, and to just try to fill people in on this terrible problem we have.
Well, then this segues perfectly to my first question, which is, you specifically lived on the streets of San Francisco in 2003 for 6 months, and you wrote a series for the Chronicle titled Shame of the City.
Yeah.
You began that series writing about a group of homeless people living on a traffic island. Here, I was going to quote something you put out. They live and die on a traffic island in the middle of a busy downtown street, surviving by panhandling drivers or turning tricks. Everyone in their colony is hooked on drugs or alcohol. They are the harsh face of the homeless in San Francisco, end quote. So tell us about these people that you got to know. Who are they and why are they there?
Well, they're still relevant today. I still know some of those folks. It was a place called Homeless Island. And in those 6 months in 2003, Brant Ward was my photography partner on that. He and I became a homeless team for 10 years at least. I lost track of how many years. And he and I slept all over the city, the Tenderloin, the Mission, the outer places, the park, to get a sense of where people were and why they were there. And we were walking around, actually, we were walking around Van Ness and Market one day. I went to get a donut, and Brant saw what he thought was a kid strolling along that traffic island at Mission Street and Van Ness. And it turned out to be a little person called Little Bit. Susan Beach was her name. And she was, everyone called her the midget or Little Bit. And she was crack and heroin addicted and turned tricks in the street. And, made some pretty good money because a lot of guys would drive in from the burbs or even come from the city, and they thought she was a kid. So they thought they were paying a kid for sex. And that just, there's a lot of things about the very bottommost end of being a homeless person that most people just don't understand. It's a survival fight like few people can relate to. And so we went over and, hey, Little Bit, how you doing? And we're chatting her up. And I wrote a song about trying to get her to talk to us because she was a tough nut. It had to be. And it turns out there was a whole colony of people on that traffic island. It was a triangular chunk of cement, which just got torn out, by the way, this past year for housing. And actually, I believe there's some housing in it. There's, they're putting a bunch of stuff on it. And there were about a dozen regulars sleeping there under a tree, shooting up, smoking crack, turning tricks, doing the things you do. And the reason they were there was panhandling was really good at the corner of Van Ness and Market. Still is. You walk out with a sign. They call it signing, where you take a piece of cardboard and say, just need some help. Anything helps. Whatever you're gonna say. And people are stopped at the light, and they're kind of stuck, and forget the pretty good money panhandling that corner. And they were nice people. You know, these were, I find most homeless people I've hung out with, they're nice people. They got dealt a bad hand from the beginning. Something knocked them off kilter along the way, any of a number of reasons, but they were always somebody's child at some point. They always had a future ahead of them at some point. And I believe they always do have a future ahead of them if they can get stabilized. And we got to know these folks really well. I wrote a whole story. That Shame of the City series went for 5 days, and the first day was just the homeless islanders. Tommy, the leader of the group, essentially rotted to death. And his girlfriend, Rita, went into a tailspin. One of the happiest things that's happened to me as a reporter is that a little later on, after that story ran and it got a lot of notice nationally and internationally, the story and the series, Rita's family read it back in Florida where they were, and they'd lost track of her. So they thought, well, there's Rita. So they flew on out, and she was ready to take help. Not every homeless person is ready to take help at any time in their lives. You gotta find someone at the right moment. You gotta offer them the right things that work, that overcome whatever survival routine they've got embedded in them by that point. She went home and she got rehabbed, and she's become a beautifully restored human being. I still know her today. It's wonderful to see someone be redeemed and be rescued and restored. And so that does happen, and I hold that in my head when I write about people, because I've written more obits than I can count on homeless people who died, particularly off the homeless island. Too many of them. It just breaks your heart, and it shouldn't be that way. It's a lack of healthcare. It's a lack of education. It's generational poverty. It's a minimum wage that doesn't pay anything if you're trying to survive. It's a whole range of factors that drive people into places like Homeless Island. And I focused on them at the time because they were very visible. And Brant shot some really moving photos, and we became flies on the wall with those folks, which is what you want to be. So you're hanging and you're telling life. And the thing that Brant and I always said to everyone we dealt with, and I say to this day, is that we want to tell a real story so people can understand what you're living with, what you're living through, and maybe you can even understand a little more about what you're living through the lens of reading about yourself. Because I've had stories written about me. It's a little weird, when you read about yourself. It's like, wow, there's a mirror, and you try to make it as accurate as you can as a mirror, but and I just hope it helps. That's the goal of doing journalism, is you want to help make the world a better place.
Did the services that were available in the city at that time, were they used by the folks? Did they help people get off the island and on with their lives?
They did. That's one of the big conundrums of homeless services, is that they use the health service quite a lot. The Tom Waddell Clinic in particular, which is a clinic right near City Hall that a lot of homeless folks go to. It's got great drug rehab counseling. It's got great on-the-spot clinic work for you. You can get your meds for whatever's bothering you. But it's, you go to your services and you go back to sleeping on the street. And at the time, back then in the early thousands, there weren't a lot of tents. Tents came along after Occupy. That made homelessness a more visible problem. It became more of a tent culture. Before then, we were sleeping on cardboard and tarps and the occasional tent. But for the chronically homeless, which is what the Homeless Island guys were, those are the people who've been on the street generally for more than a year and have compounding problems like mental illness or drug addiction. It's really, really hard to address it, because I saw a little bit, and the others go into rehab, try rehab, go into jail, go into hospitals because they'd get an infection or something. And the really well-meaning counselors who try really hard, and it breaks their hearts too, would try to enlist them and get them, stabilized. And it rarely seemed to work because there's when you got your life so dysfunctional that you're always scared, always uncertain, always feeling under siege. You hang on to the things you know what to do, and it's a really tough persuasion job to get someone to agree to take whatever you're offering them, which is, so you can't force most people to take drug rehab, housing, services, bus ticket out of town, whatever you have on hand. And having said that, a lot of homeless people do want the help. Chronically homeless people are only 20 to 40% of the population. Those are the ones you see all the time. Those are the ones everyone complains about. And the other 60, 70, 80%, depending on your community, are mostly episodic. Something knocked them off. They're out of their job. They got a bad divorce. They got sick. Who knows? But they eventually, crawl their way back up into stability, and they do take the services that get offered. But the chronic folks, it's tougher. And I'll tell you, man, you have a conversation at 3 a.m. with chronically homeless folks. They don't want to be homeless. No one really wants to be homeless. I mean, they may think at the moment, if they're young, they're being bohemian and chasing some kind of outdoorsy dream or something. But living outside where you can get your teeth kicked in and you have to hunt around for food every day, that no one enjoys that. That's just what I truly believe.
So one last thing to the experience you had there. There was a quote you had, said, shopkeepers, passerbys, and commuters who see the islanders say they feel pity, anger, or revulsion, and mostly they look right past them. Mm-hmm. But not one said that they ever actually had a conversation with the islander in the years they've been there, other than to tell them to get out of the way, end quote. Yeah. So have you seen San Franciscans' reaction to the homeless over the years? Has that been changing?
I think it might have changed a little bit. Everyone's gotten more used to the problem, which then exacerbates the pity, the revulsion, all those adjectives I used. But it is a very kind city, and a lot of homeless folks are very approachable. I mean, if you see someone who's screaming at a telephone pole or looks angry and agitated, yeah, you're not going to go talk to that guy if you're just Joe or Joan normal walking down the street. But a lot of homeless folks like to talk, and it's and I do think people do stop and talk. I know I talk to a lot of folks who engage homeless people in the street, and there's a lot of kindness that goes on. A lot of people give sandwiches, deliver food. Neighborhoods adopt homeless people, so to speak, who are staying in one place and kind of take care of them on the street. And the ones who, for some reason, haven't connected with housing or aren't ready to go into housing, but stay in those kind of neighborhoods, it's a really touching kind of relationship. I mean, sure, there are some of those relationships that are a little toxic. When someone's really off and they're disruptive in a neighborhood, that's a problem. When you get gangs of or groups of drug dealers who some of whom may be homeless, some of not, who set up shop in a neighborhood, that can really be unpleasant. There's a difference between your typical homeless person and an actual criminal. I mean, a lot of homeless folks, especially if they're drug addicted, will boost a few things now and then to pay for the drugs. But generally, they're not hardcore criminals. The hardcore criminals who show up are predators, and they mess up the the ecosystem even more than it already is. The folks that I enjoy most spending time with are just the ones who like being acknowledged as human beings for a few minutes of conversation or a long conversation, and want to tell you what happened, tell you about their lives. And at this point in my career, I always circle it around the conversation around to saying, well, what do you want to do to get off the street? Do you want to get off the street? Gee, maybe you should go to, and then fill in the blank for any of a number of places I think might be handy. I'm not really a street counselor, but I do know a few things in a few places, and I'm very happy to help someone think through how they can make their lives better. Because, like I said, that's what journalism is. You're trying to make people's lives better.
So a lot of people that are just now kind of learning about homelessness to a degree they may never have in the past, because of course the problem seems to be becoming more acute in San Francisco or more visible. They're hearing this, I'm assuming, and thinking, okay, so there's a lot of sympathy for how people get into the situation. And I know people want to be compassionate in how this is dealt with. And I know they're wondering, well, what can be done to encourage somebody, these folks that are staying on the street who don't want to leave, to realize that it's impacting more than just themselves. Like their presence or what's going on impacts the whole community around them. How would you respond to that?
I think the mind frame that can be handy for that is understanding that it's not that people don't want to leave, it's they're not ready to leave. They're not in a place where they can leave. And kindness is the best thing you can bring to the plate. Talk about acknowledging someone as for who they are and what their problems are. Chronically homeless people have problems that are hard to understand for someone who's had a pretty easy life. You go to college, you get a job, you own a house, things are good. Talking to someone who got beaten up as a kid and got whored out as a girl when she was 10. I mean, the stories that drove people to the streets are mind-numbing. And not everyone who's chronic has these mind-numbing stories. Sometimes they had a mental episode, or they lost their job and never figured out how to climb back and then got into the drugs. But listening to what they have to say, and also just shooting the shit. Homeless people like to read books. They watch things on TV through the phone apps or in the shelters or wherever they happen to get access. Talk about. I've had plenty of great conversations about John Steinbeck's writings with homeless folks, or Stephen King, and letting them know that there is another part of the world that acknowledges and cares and notices. That all helps. It's that Zen water on a rock. It's becoming an influence that helps them feel like they could get to an easier way of life, a better way of life. And it's kindness.
Some people have shared with me, because we talk to people all day, every day, learning about this stuff, and they had said, when you walk by, smile and say hi. Just that simple act. You don't have to give them money if that's not where you're comfortable, but make them feel like a human. And it sounds to me that could be the little efforts that start to make them feel ready to take the care and trust those that will then get them off the street. If that's being the chronic issue that's, maintaining their space on the street and not moving on to some of the services. And I know there's sometimes you go through the services, but then you come out the back end of it. Maybe you're clean, you've gone through some detox, but there's nowhere to live, or there's, you kind of hit a dead end. And that's a whole nother, it's a problem some other speakers have and will be addressing. But I want to go on here and just mention something else here. So each summer, I know you lead what's called the San Francisco SF Homeless Project, which is a group of media organizations focusing on homelessness. The project includes a Q&A section that answers readers' questions. And last year, the article discussed the causes of homelessness extensively. So here's one of the passages. Quote, Low-income housing aid limitations by the federal government, which began making huge cuts in the 1980s, is often blamed as the major cause of homelessness that makes it nearly impossible for local communities to solve the problem. Nationally, an inadequate healthcare system, income inequality, and institutional racism are also to blame, end quote. So this passage gives the 30,000-foot perspective on the causes of homelessness. How do you see these dynamics play out on the streets of San Francisco?
Well, I probably wrote that sentence, so I believe it. We're just now finishing the SF Homeless Project for this year, and it'll run July 6th for a week.
You maybe want to explain a little more to people what that's about.
Yeah, it's a week-long series of stories and podcasts that I help lead with the editors, and we have some great reporters enlisted in this. Last year we did a different kind of homeless project where we spent a 24-hour cycle with many types of aspects of homelessness on buses and at the waterfront and a shelter, trying to get a job, this kind of thing. This year we went back to the kind of format we had before. I read a story that runs on Monday, the 6th, that gives an overview, the 30,000-foot view, where I talk to everyone from President Trump's homeless czar down to homeless folks in the streets, to kind of give a perspective of what homelessness is like, particularly during the time of coronavirus, because coronavirus has affected everything we do. It's made things worse. And then we have a series of other stories on looking at seniors in the street, which your earlier guest Margot Kushel is a wonderful expert on. We're doing looking at mental illness, looking at the explosion of homelessness in the suburbs, which is what I was gonna do that as our homeless project this year before the pandemic hit. So we just kind of repurposed that into one of the days of the project. And it goes on like that. And we have podcasts. I'm doing a podcast with our managing editor, Damien Bolwa, talking about the series as a whole. And I think it's Wednesday on the 8th, I believe it is. We're doing a forum, kind of like this. I've got 3 panelists that'll be on Zoom with me at 6 o'clock that night. You look we've got notices going up on Twitter and on the Chronicle site, where I have Congresswoman Jackie Spear, Margot Kushel, and Tamika Moss from this great new nonprofit called All Home that thinks regionally on homelessness. And we're just going to yak about homelessness for an hour. And all 3 of those women know quite a bit. And then it ends off in, I believe, Sunday with an editorial from John Diaz, who's our great editorial page editor, who I went to high school with.
Small world.
Yeah, small world. But his team is going to write an editorial, kind of trying to sum up and make sense of all this. So tune in, read, watch, look at it online.
Oh, we'll share it. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll make sure people get a hold of it.
Sure.
Okay, I have a question too. San Francisco spends, as we know, vast resources on homelessness and has pioneered some of the leading practices that other cities and countries use. But why is the problem, or from your perspective, why is the problem of homelessness so persistent in San Francisco?
It's the income inequality is generally the one-shot answer. We have the biggest split on income inequality in the country. Although I think we kind of vie out for the #1 spot with a few other cities now and then. But it's you got very poor people. If you're a laborer, if you're working class, it's hard to live in a city where it has the most expensive real estate. Also, in addition to the income inequality, it's New York, and I think New York and we usually bat back and forth on who's more expensive overall. But it's tough to make a living, and if you're doing a job like punching a counter somewhere or janitorial work, you make so little money anyway. It's very hard to live somewhere else that you can afford, where you can afford a room more easily and commute in all the time. I mean, The bridge toll's $7. The gas is expensive. The parking is crazy. It's $20 a day. So you kind of have to try to live in the city, and it's very, very hard. Cheap places are tough to find, and our healthcare system sucks. In San Francisco, you have universal healthcare, which helps, but people not exactly who had lived in San Francisco and then came here, or who need healthcare for their families, and living in other areas. All you have to do is get a very bad condition going on, and you can go bankrupt. And our disability payments generally for low-income people, if you lose a leg and you had been a guy who did nothing but swing a hammer for your whole life, you're going to get $1,000 a month for disability. What's that going to do for you in San Francisco? And a lot of homeless folks, 70% at least of the homeless folks in San Francisco lived here before they became homeless. You generally stay in the community that you grew up in or you lived in and became familiar with because it's what you know. That's true all over the country. Most homeless people stay in one place, and most of them want to stay where they know the landscape, they have history, because when you're really desperate on the very, very bottom, you reach out to whoever you think might be able to help you, and a lot of those avenues get used up along the way. But it's scary, and it's a survival fight to be in the streets. So you do whatever you can.
It sounds like, I've learned for these efforts I've undergone over the last few months, but maybe a lot of people don't understand the different populations of the homeless, because I know there's the folks you just were talking about sound more like the economics put them out on the streets. And there's others, there could be other reasons why, or the chronic ones we were talking about before, where there's just a myriad of issues that are deepening their reasons for not leaving the streets. Can you just kind of help people understand those different communities and or different subpopulations within the homeless community, and what kinds of paths they each could have to getting out of homelessness?
Yeah, well, the most visible ones, of course, are the chronics, the chronically homeless, and that's 30 to 40% in San Francisco, and about anywhere from a third to a half. Percentages vary, have mental illness, and another third to a half have drug problems, and that's just the self-reported ones. If the most visible ones are the ones that people walk by and they're watching them shoot up in the streets or in the tents, and that's the most disturbing. And the problem is we need more and more vigorous drug rehab facilities and mental health facilities, and they're expensive. Mm-hmm. Our society doesn't like spending money on the bottom end of society. That's what I've seen since I became a reporter a long time ago.
Did you reference that it's more expensive for people to be on the street than to house them? Didn't you have some statistics on that?
Yeah, if you house someone in supportive housing, which is the free housing, an apartment or a room in a complex with counseling services on site, and they come visit, and so that you're always there and say, "Hey, Joe, want to get into drug rehab today?" And you really only can clean up and get good services once you got a roof. Well, if you're in one of those, that's about $30,000 a year. If you're absolutely, hardcore on the street, you're about $85,000 a year. That's in police calls, ambulance calls, hospital stays, the street cleaner guys coming by and hosing the thing off. If you plate in all that kind of money, it's very expensive. The trouble is, this argument is, I've put this figure in for years now, but it's gray money, it's fuzzy money, because some folks say, well, if we house the guy, where's my $50,000 I'm saving on him? It's in the police, it's in the ambulance, it's in the hospital, and it's not really. You can't just take that money and move it over into a column and say, okay, save that money on Joe. It's you see it overall, and you're going to see it overall. If we housed everyone off the street, then you'd see, and we did it quickly, you'd see an immediate savings like that. But it's subtle, and that makes it hard to make the argument because you know, as a society, we're fairly short-sighted. We want to see the dollars and the cents right now. A lot of the folks in City Hall, they get it. I think London Breed understands the dynamics of the issue, but it's a huge apparatus. You got all these players, all these managers, all the money folks, the constituents. It becomes it's just a huge system, and moving it is kind of like, you know, shoving a freighter through a channel. It goes an inch at a time sometimes.
That's part of what we wanted to do. I mean, here we're residents and businesses throughout San Francisco, across all 11 districts. We're not political. We're not getting paid to do this. You know, we don't have any other agenda other than to help. And you know, we talk to all these different groups, whether they're within the city or nonprofits or individuals, and we're starting to see some common themes. And one of them is, you know, a lot of people trying hard to do the right thing, but a lot of red tape and bureaucracy and things that, you know, a business person coming in would be like, this needs to be redone. And that's the kind of frustration I think a lot of people feel like, can we make this better? Can we get something in there and start to clean this up and help these people get off the street? It's a crime that people are left to suffer like this. I think that's what a lot of people feel.
Yeah, and one of the main troubles is that until you have enough housing to put people into, you're really not going to see a whole lot of needle moving on it.
What about housing outside of San Francisco?
That's actually a real option. And I'll tell you, for homeless families, more than half of the homeless families that get housed now, who are homeless in San Francisco, get housed outside of the city because you can afford it better. You're not going to stick a family of 5 into a one-room SRO unit in the Tenderloin. They can get a lot more bang for the buck in somewhere like Stockton, and it's more cost-effective for the city to send someone to a city like Stockton with support, because they don't just, you know, give them a bus ticket and say get out. They help pay the rent, help pay for you know, job counseling, help really get them situated so they become successful outside of the city, and that way they don't fail and come back here for, you know, like, where am I going to go? Oh, I'll go back there. You know, you want to help people succeed, and that's a good thing. It's cheaper overall for everyone, and yeah, that's a good thing. There are a lot of ideas all the time about regionalism, and it's tough to pull it off. People have to share their money. Generally, historically, what's happened is people try to launch something that interlinks across county lines, and you know, the other county says, well, that's great, but don't give me all your homeless guys. It's a tough conversation. I think there's some movement on that because it's become such a region-wide problem that I know all the mayors of the major cities are talking pretty regularly about doing something to cooperate. And there's a bunch of, you know, that's a whole conversation, but I think that's hopeful.
Well, we'll probably read about more of it when you have your series coming up.
I think you will, yeah.
So at this point, thank you. This has been super interesting, and I think for myself and those listening, I'm going to leave a little time now to answer questions from the audience. So I'm going to let Sean pop back in.
Hey, thank you.
Sure.
So we do have a lot of questions actually. I want to start with something very simple. We see a lot of blame for homelessness being placed on our institutions. Is there any point in holding the people on the streets responsible for their own well-being?
Oh yeah, there is a personal responsibility. There's a huge debate at all times with extremes on the right and extremes on the left. The extreme example in this country is in New York City, where the law says you can go to the police can go to a homeless person and say you either get jail or you get shelter. And that's that law is one reason Manhattan has looked pretty clean of homeless issues for years. I mean, it's kind of backslid lately, but the cost of that is that you have 70,000 homeless people jammed into ever fading, aging, crappy shelters out in the boroughs, with very little, with not enough ability to put them into permanent housing. So there's a lot of misery. It's just not misery you see all the time. So that's just a peachy keen, solution for some folks. I think a lot of folks, particularly in San Francisco, would not go for that. It's asking homeless people to take responsibility that's a tough conversation. You go to a hardcore drug addict or someone who's mentally ill and under our legal system, and you say, you need to take responsibility and go inside. Time and time again, I've talked to mentally ill people who say, if I go inside, the aliens are going to get me. Or the world's against me, and the safest place I have is this tree stump right here, right now. It's an illogical conversation that is very hard to push past, given our laws, because you can't force people to take services. And a hardcore drug addict is scared. If I go inside, where am I going to get my dope? Am I going to have to do cold turkey in a way I don't want to do it? Am I going to like the curfews and the strictures that they put on me in a lockdown rehab or even just a residential rehab, because I had bad experiences with stuff before? I mean, it's a whole range of things. And then there's a lot of people that say, yeah, save me. I mean, that happens plenty of times. You do get that. It's not like everyone who's homeless is some, ne'er-do-well who doesn't want to be helped. It's far more complex than that.
Yeah. And from the perspective of like John or Joan Normal, as you coined, what do you think comes first a lot of people see drug use, we see alcohol use on the streets.
Yeah.
What do you think comes first, the alcohol, the drug use, the addiction, or the homelessness, or is there like even a pattern to that?
It's a combo. It's a combination. If you are chronically, desperately homeless for more than a year, it's very hard to stay away from booze or drugs. I just did a story this last year on a guy named Tyson Filzer, who I met in the street, and he's doing a little bit of dope, I think mostly pot, when he lost his job and everything fell through, and he wound up in the streets in San Francisco. And he said, he tried to resist it for a long time, but meth and heroin just it kind of gets you. Not everyone who's chronic is a drug addict, but it's very hard to resist. And conversely, if you are deeply into drugs, if you're a heroin addict or a meth addict or a crack addict, and you've done that for a long time, it's very hard to maintain a normal life of having a job and being responsible to your family and whatnot. And that can throw you into the streets because you use up everything around you. It's expensive. I mean, dope is, if you're just trying to chip a little bit as a tourist in the drug world, it's a little cheap, but it gets very expensive when you dive headfirst into it.
Yeah. So I have a slightly different one. We have a number of questions that are related to what people in the community can do. And so, for instance, volunteer organizations like our own want to make a difference citywide. How would you suggest groups like ours get engaged, and what would be like good first actions?
That we have at the Chronicle, we have a handy how-to help guide that's going to run. It's online and it'll run with the Homeless Project. Just go to the Homeless Project landing page at the Chronicle and you'll find a quick link to it. It's got scores actually of organizations. Pick something that works for you. Go visit them. See if those folks who are running that outfit. St. Anthony's is a kind of a full service thing. They do health services, shelter, food. See what they do to try that, what that organization or another one, they're places for LGBT homeless people. There are places that serve youth homeless people. There's a galaxy of nonprofits in the city that do that. Connect with them. Don't invent the wheel. Reinvent the wheel. Go see what people are doing and connect with them and see how you can help them. And do that with several organizations. Find what fits for you, and then help. And then if you want to innovate and do your own thing, you'll be more informed. You'll know. You'll be more grounded. Don't try not to make the same mistakes that everyone else had to make when they were trying to get their thing going. So that's what I would suggest. Find something that works for you, and join. Ask how you can help, connect. Even things like the Salvation Army is handing out food right now in the pandemic to homeless people who are on the street. It's pretty unusual to have it on the scale that they're doing. Maybe you can volunteer. I don't know if they're even taking volunteers, but most people seem to like having help. Spend a couple of days walking around talking to folks in tents who are hungry, and you'll learn a few things.
Yeah. From a more civic or legislative approach, we see like Scott Wiener's attempt to increase housing development, or even like what you were talking about, New York's solution seemed like it was a little heavy-handed, but have you seen something in that space that really works, that like from the legislative side that maybe folks in the city could get behind?
Well, talk to your city supervisors of the natural conduit for that. There are nonprofit advocacy organizations, depending on how what your bent is. You can do the Hotel Council, which does a more moderate political advocacy, or you can do something like WRAP, the Western Regional Advocacy Project, which is more comes at it from a much more liberal viewpoint. Anytime you get politics mixed into it, you get arguments and noise. I don't particularly enjoy dealing with the politics. I'd rather talk to a homeless guy than a politician in general. Start with see what your supervisors say. See what these advocacy organizations say. There's a lot of voices doing a lot of advocacy all the time, and so understand that you're joining a pretty loud conversation when you're pitching into it. Something like one of the voices that I wind up talking to quite a bit is Tipping Point Community. Those guys are always coming up with ideas and trying to push things ahead, and they have a voice in City Hall. I really can't advise one place to go to. You have to shop.
Yeah. So a big part of the people who are here in our coalition are simply people who see what's happening in the streets and can't and don't want to live with this anymore. And some of it is even coming from a place of anger and emotion that might not be, of course, as useful. How do we sort of bring those people in a way that either makes them a little more sympathetic or gives them or soothes some of their issues?
That's a tough one, because the problem's not going away tomorrow or next week. It's kind of dug in for a while, and I know a lot of the people who are working on it in the nonprofit world, in the city government, homeless coalition. Everyone really wants to make the problem go away. The homeless people want to make the problem go away. It's dug in. It's going to take a lot of patience, and I don't know what to tell you on that one.
I know you worked on an article back in 2014 that compared Salt Lake City to San Francisco.
Yeah.
And I thought that there was some really interesting kind of points in there, considering a lot of the things we're doing here in San Francisco are the same things they were doing in Salt Lake City, just at maybe at a different scale. Could you talk a little bit about that for a moment?
Yeah, the interesting thing to me was that they had about this, if I remember right, they had about the same chronic homeless population that we do, or we did at the time. And the difference for them is that they had a lot of cheaper real estate, and they had a lot more land available. I mean, it's Utah. There are places to locate people. And they there were a couple of motels that got converted that I thought turned into wonderful supportive housing projects. They went deep on supportive housing. And one of the game changers for them was money, was resources. They had the Mormon Church, which made all the furniture for these supportive housing units, pumped in a lot of dough, donated the lead director for their project, and it really turned it for them. It's right now in this pandemic, there's actually a little bit of hope in this, that in that real estate is dropping in price, rents are dropping in price. Some buildings are going to become available, particularly the motels and hotels that they're going to have a hard time for quite a while. The governments all over the country, including in San Francisco, are hoping they can get their hands on some motels that say, we're not getting tourists back for quite a while here. Rent my hotel and turn it into housing, or buy it and turn it into housing. So the city's looking into doing that, and that could really make a big difference. It would make it's housing. Housing is the issue. Housing, and then you need jobs too. But if you're not going to house people, you're not going to make a dent in the problem. And interestingly, which you will read in my story on July 6th, in the Great Recession about a decade ago, homelessness actually went down because suddenly people could afford a place to live, and governments could afford to find places to put homeless people into. So there may be some hope on that, and God knows what kind of political pressure or financial pressure will have to be mustered to shove that forward. But that's the difference that Salt Lake had. They had housing and they had resource. And so Lloyd Pendleton, the guy who ran that program, he was a Mormon who was donating his time, told me, well, we have the church here. You guys have tech in San Francisco. There's a lot of money in tech. And I wrote that, and God knows if I doubt I was directly responsible for it, but tech started, putting money in. Guys like Mark Benioff have put millions of dollars into addressing the problem. And the trouble is, it's such a massive issue. It takes such a huge amount of money that people's eyes bulge when you start talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, that Prop C was going to put $300 million into the issue every year. That's a ton of dough, and that would really move the needle. Some people look at that and say, oh my God, why are we going to spend that kind of money on poor people? And other people would look at that and say, let's go, because it makes up for a lot of the funding that got whacked out decades ago. I don't know where that leads you.
It sounds to me like you're saying supportive housing was the key to Salt Lake City's success. Yeah. So let's say we get some good supportive housing structures here and we're able to get people into these. You said before they have a future ahead of them. People have a lot of these people have a future that they're looking forward to, or that they could look forward to. Can you describe what you've seen when they actually get the help they need?
Yeah. I'll take a little bit as an example from a long ago. I know plenty of people in supportive housing now. Little bit finally got cooked, as they say, which she was tired of turning tricks in the street. And she finally said, okay, put me in a supportive housing unit. She did. She moved in, she cleaned up, had a house, had a pet rat, had a boyfriend. And she lasted about a year, maybe a year and a half. And then her body failed on her and she died. But she lived a good last year or so of her life, and that corner that she was on was the better for it, because there was that much less panhandling, drug use, public display. Everyone benefited out of that. There are, oh God, 9,000 people in supportive housing in San Francisco already, and the city is I don't know if desperate's the word, but super eager to increase that as much as they can. And it's for the most chronic people. You don't just take, your normal homeless person, so to speak, who lost a job 6 months ago and is probably going to wind up doing okay once they find another one and get stabilized. They don't need supportive housing. They just need a place to live that they can afford.
Right.
So it's affordable housing and it's supportive housing. Those things are what make the difference.
And what,
It's as simple as that.
and just we have only a few moments left, and I'm going to hand this back to Lori in a second. But I thought I would ask you one last question about people who refuse to take services, people who just want nothing to do with it. How do we then interact with them as a community?
That one's tough. It's interesting because, the governor, Newsom, was mayor when I was sleeping he wasn't mayor when I was sleeping in the street, but after my series ran, I spent a lot of time with that guy because he made a big push at trying to house homeless people. And one of his catchphrases is he doesn't believe that people are service resistant. And I know what he means. And he and I walked around in homeless camps a lot without all the cameras and shit around us. So he could understand the problem and we could have conversations. And I think he understood. People aren't resistant. They're just not right. They're not ready at that moment to take the help for any of a range of reasons. But the fact is, if you're living in an apartment and you have someone who's not taking the help and they're squatting outside your house and they're problematic, no one likes that. It's a behavioral problem. And it's thorny. It involves, a lot of times it'll involve the cops if they're breaking things. It involves having street counselors come by and work on them to try to get them to change their minds, try to get them to accept. Your typical hardcore chronic homeless person, it can take 2 years of engagement, steady engagement with a street counselor before they finally say, all right, I'll give your thing a shot. It's a tragedy. It shouldn't be like that. But it is not a black and white problem at all. My heart goes out to the chronically homeless person who doesn't want the help at that time, and my heart goes out to the person who feels disrupted and feels put upon by having to deal with disruptive behavior in front of their house. It's not, none of that is good for anyone involved.
I'm going to hand this back to Lori now to wrap up. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin.
Sure.
So, well, first, thank you to everyone who was joined us in the audience. Another, I think, really informative talk today where we learned a lot more than we might have before showing up. And Kevin, thank you so much for all you do on this regard and for constantly keeping our city and beyond informed on these issues. And we look forward to your SF homeless project that's coming out. We'll make sure everyone has a link to that. And I just wanted to do my typical commercial at this point and just let you know everyone know what's coming up. So first off, today's talk will be recorded and we'll put it on our website. If you go to the events, there's past events. In fact, Dr. Kuchel's talk from last week is already up there. And next Wednesday, July 1st at noon, we're going to have the Dean of UC Hastings Law School, David Fagan, with us, and he will tell us about Hastings' lawsuit against the city and county of San Francisco to clean up the Tenderloin. I think you will be very interested to hear what he has to say and what's going on there, so don't miss that. The following week on July 8th at noon, we will be talking with Eileen Richardson and Romy Nottage. They are with the Downtown Streets team, and that's an innovative nonprofit that is helping the homeless rebuild their lives on a path to recovery and self-sufficiency. And then one more that we can announce now is we're excited to announce that we'll be having on Wednesday, July 15th. It's a different time than normal. We can try to make it from 12 to 1. This will be at 1:30, and it's with Emily Cohen. She is the Interim Director of Strategy and External Affairs at San Francisco's Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing. So they are kind of command central right now within our city in developing policy and making sure it's played out through the different service providers. And she will be here to tell us what San Francisco is doing and to answer our questions. And I think she's a really important person for us to hear from. And she's also someone that we hope to interact with down the line as our coalition starts to put together a framework of issues we feel need to be addressed and be able to share with her our position on that. So that's what we have for today. Please register on our website at rescuesf.org. And that concludes our talk. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Oh, our pleasure.